Hello and welcome to a bit of a strange edition of the Bill of Rights Institute's 10th period webinar series. My name is Kirk Higgins. I'm the Senior Content Manager for the Bill of Rights Institute.
And my name is Rachel Davison-Humphreys. I'm the Director of Outreach at the Bill of Rights Institute.
And we hope that you are all staying healthy and well during this COVID-19 pandemic. We very much appreciate you all joining us, and we hope today to take a look at how Americans have dealt with crises in the past, using the current crises as a lens through which to view that. And ultimately, we really hope that we can be there for you through this difficult time, both in providing resources and also maybe in a bit of an escape and thinking about things in new ways.
So we're going to start off by thinking a little bit about what American responses to crisis mean. So we are in a very global society right now, and we're hearing a lot of stories from a lot of different countries where cultures and responses vary widely. And so we're seeing, and your students are seeing, lots of different options for how to respond play out, not only overseas, but actually here across the United States. Kansas is doing very different things than New York, which are doing very different things than California, which are doing very different things than Washington, D.C., which is doing different things than Virginia. And so one of the places that I always go when I think about this multitude and when I think about American response is one of my favorite books on American history, which is Alexis De Tocqueville's Democracy in America. So in Democracy in America was this fantastic, very, very prescient text written in 1835 by a Frenchman who had come to the United States to study our prison system and its effectiveness. And over the course of his, I think it was 8 to 12 weeks, I don't quite remember how long he was in the United States, he visited all different levels of society and observed and brought back what he saw as the future for effectively France as it transitioned into democracy. And he was not always a fan of democratic institutions. He himself was an aristocrat, so he's pretty critical of what democracy does in terms of certain kinds of culture. But one of the things that he absolutely recognized in American culture was this idea that Americans rally around problems in their communities. And so in this quote from Democracy in America, he says, "The inhabitant of the United States learns from birth that he must depend on himself in the struggle against the ills and difficulties of life. He looks upon social authority only with a defiant and uneasy eye, and calls upon its power only when he cannot do without it. This begins to be noticed as early as school, where children, even in their games, submit to their own rules and punish their own infractions. The same spirit is found in all actions of social life. An obstruction occurs on a public road, the way is interrupted, traffic stops, the neighbors get together as a deliberative body, and out of this improvised assembly, they will come an executive power that will remedy the situation, the difficulty, before the idea of an authority predated that in anyone's imagination. So if it is a matter of pleasure, the Americans will associate to give even more splendor and order to the festival." And they also do this with intellectual enemies. In the United States, they associate for the purposes of public security, commerce, industry, pleasure, morality, religion. There is nothing that human will despairs of achieving by the free action of the collective power of individuals. And so whenever there's a crisis, there's this great quote that goes around from Mr. Rogers to look for the helpers. And the joy that I'm able to find and the kind of beauty that I'm able to see is to see all of the people trying to help. And that happens in every example of a crisis in the United States. And so that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, and I think that's a really powerful message too, because as educators, oftentimes we're observing the world around us and trying to make sense of it, right? And working with our students to make sense of those things. And I think Tocqueville's words here are a really good lens to do that, right? Because he positions it in a way that it's saying, look at the organizations that are around us. And so I think we see two kinds of reactions. I think we'll touch on both of these a little bit today, but we see the macro reactions, right? So we see our governors and elected officials on both the federal, the national, and state levels, talking to us about what the response is of the government. At the same time, we're seeing wonderful examples of people delivering food to the elderly, or of people going to blood banks, or of people donating time in whatever ways they can, or in restaurants and things, selling non-essential goods that they now don't need because they're just doing delivery or takeout. And I think it's the constellation of all those things that make up that sort of a very real world display of civics in action, right? I mean, it's all those levels. And I think it's a great time to look at civil society and see it as a way that's a lot more than voting and serving on juries and doing those things that we often relate as our civic, our civic mindedness, right? I mean, civil society is looking out for one another. And I think this is a very human moment. It's very much a moment for us to reflect on not only what it means to be a part of those communities, but what it really means to be a human being. Think about what it means that we value. And I think that throughout American history, we've responded to these things. I think it's important to keep in mind that history gives us solace in the sense that we are not alone in going through these crises, and that these crises occur over time. And this is not, unfortunately, going to be the last crisis, but nor is it the first one that's ever struck us either. And I think knowing that we are in community with all those other Americans who have struggled through difficult times like these, it can give us some support and help us to better understand what it is that's unfolding around us, even as there's so much uncertainty.
Absolutely. Well, the first one I think we're going to talk about is the one that comes to mind most often, especially for history teachers, which is the influenza epidemic of 1918. So Kirk, why don't you kind of position us in history when it comes to this epidemic that occurred, but 1918, 1919.
Sure. So I think this epidemic stands out for a lot of people for a number of reasons, but not least of which is that it's fairly modern. I mean, 100 years ago isn't, it seems a long time ago, I think, to many of our students. But
Wednesday seems a long time ago, Kirk.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, yeah, at this time of sort of truncated time. But 100 years ago is really at the dawn of what we would call the modern age, right? Or maybe even getting close to the postmodern age. Don't ask me how they come up with these terms. But 1918 is a time that society looks a lot more like it does now than it did even 100 years before that, right? And so I think we were at a point where we were understanding and identifying these pandemics a lot more readily, that information was speeding around the world a lot more quickly, facilitated by advancements in technology. And that has allowed us to see it as more of a distinct thing. But most importantly, it was a horrifically deadly and horrifically disruptive disease that came on top of a horrifically destructive war, being the First World War. And many of the problems that resulted from the Spanish influenza were directly as a result of the devastation that had been wrought by the First World War, both in what medical care and supplies were available and what systems were in place, but also in how the war affected the movements of people and how it affected who was sick and where they were, which accentuated the spread, right? So people who were ill were being more readily identified if they were in units as soldiers. Those people moved to the back where ordinarily they would stay home. They're already out in public. Now they're being placed in very crowded areas where there's even more people who are all being taken care of at the same time. And that really accentuated this spread. And so, so it was a horrifically deadly disease, but we can also learn a lot, I think, from looking at how it is that the nation responded. And Rachel's pulled a great document here for us to take a look at that.
Yeah, so I, as you know, if you know anything about the Bill of Rights Institute, we're a bit of nerds. We love diving into the primary sources and seeing what we can draw out of it. I find this document fascinating, so I'm going to lean in a little bit because it's kind of small on my screen. But so this document is it comes from the federal government on September 26, 1918, and it is a document that gives the suggested actions for the public in the face of this disease. And it says, so the present epidemic is a disease plainly called influenza, but the term Spanish influenza has been applied because of its recent prevalence in Spain. Sound familiar? Influenza occurs every year in the United States, but it's more contagious during an epidemic, and pneumonia is a more frequent complication. So then it gives a list of suggested actions. So fresh air and sunshine kill the germ in just a few minutes. The disease is spread by the moist secretions of the nose and throat of infected persons, so protect yourself from infection, keep well, and do not get hysterical over the epidemic. I love early 19th century exhortations. But what I would do with this document is say, possibly give this document to students and then go to the CDC guidelines for what they could do, because this next set of guidelines sounds very familiar. Protect yourself from infection. So avoid being sprayed in the eyes and throat, secretions of others. Beware of those who are coughing and sneezing. Avoid crowded streetcars. Walk to the office as possible. Keep out of crowds. Avoid theaters, moving picture shows, and other places of public assembly. Do not travel by railroad except when absolutely necessary. We could substitute an airplane. Do not drink from glasses or cups which have been used by others until they've been thoroughly washed. You can do much to lessen the danger to yourself by keeping in good physical condition. Avoid close, stuffy, and poorly ventilated rooms, and insist upon fresh air, but avoid disagreeable drafts. Eat simple, nourishing foods and drink plenty of water. Secure at least 7 hours sleep. Avoid physical fatigue. Do not sleep or sit around in damp clothing. Keep the feet dry. So, again, this is a document that came out in 1918. Comparing and contrasting to the document that came out as part of the CDC guidelines could be a really interesting activity. And so it says practically the great danger from influenza is pneumonia, which we hear now that practically the great danger of COVID-19 is the diminished lung capacity, and which tends to follow in a considerable percentage of the cases. So for the protection of others, if you are really sick, stay at home and remain there until the fever is over. A day in bed at the very beginning may also save you from serious complications later on. If you become ill, don't try to keep on with your work. Fight the disease rationally and do not become unduly alarmed. So a little words of advice from the 1918 flu pandemic.
And we should say, if you're interested in looking at this document or any of the other resources that we mentioned, they all will be below in the description of the video that you're watching. And in addition to that, as we're going through all of this, if there's any resources that we can provide to you, the educators, please let us know on any of our social media outlets. We're on Twitter, Facebook, at BR Institute. And also on Instagram or here on YouTube. We're here chatting with you now. So if you have any resources that you would like to see or like us to put together, please reach out. But looking at this document, a few things strike me. So one that is a government document, I think is just really interesting, right? So how is it that the government is trying to solve this problem or this crisis? And so it's giving very practical, good, clear instructions on how to try to limit the spread. But I also think it's not, what it's not trying to do is either diminish or exaggerate what's happening. It's very much a matter of fact kind of telling of what's going on and what you as an individual can do to prepare it. And so even in that, though, that it's focusing on the individual and what you can do and what your responsibilities are as a member of this community, I think are really interesting and could be fun to explore with students.
So the next document is actually also on the Spanish flu. It is a really, again, if you want something that's really accessible to students to give them kind of an overview. This is a Smithsonian Magazine article from 2017, which takes the history of the Spanish flu, lays it out very clearly, but also brings it into common context, looking at other epidemics throughout history. So this would be a great article to share with your students from Smithsonian. Where again, it talks about, this was in 2017, the author was saying that more epidemics could come forward, and that there would be less glamorous measures known as non-pharmaceutical interventions, like hand washing, telecommuting, covering coughs, staying home when sick instead of going to work, and if the pandemic is severe enough, widespread school closings, and possibly more extreme controls. The hope is that layering such actions one on top of another will reduce the impact of an outbreak on public health and on resources in today's just-in-time economy. But the effectiveness of such interventions will depend on public compliance, and the public will have to trust what is being told. And I think, again, even that paragraph, having a discussion on that paragraph, having students analyze what they've been seeing, what their experience has been in relation to this. But the other thing that this does is, because this document is from 2017, So much of the sense of uncertainty comes from the fact that this is culturally our first time experiencing this, right? We have no context in which to place ourselves when it comes to what our response should be. And I find solace in this, that we're doing everything we should be doing. This author and those he quotes in 2017 was like, this is what happens if something happens. And there's a bit of solace in that idea for me personally, that we are being cared for in the way that we should be, and that our non-pharmaceutical interventions are the ones that are suggested and have always been suggested. And the reasons are clear for why we're doing these things.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Rachel, I was wondering what you thought of that passage about public trust, right? Because I think this hits on something that Tocqueville was talking about, but in the lead up to this, much of the conversation about politics in the United States has to do with partisanship, right? Or has to do with differing debates about approaches on things.
Right.
And now we find ourselves at a moment where that public trust, you could bold it and underline it, right? I mean, we're reliant on that. And I wonder, just thinking about Tocqueville too, what it says about us as a nation and us as a community, that ostensibly there is a lot of public trust being shared right now.
There really is. And I think,
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons that that's the case, so there are layers of association within any person's community, right? You have lots of different ways that you are associating, and lots of different groups that you're a part of, and you have different levels of trust with all those different groups. We see this with our one of our favorite statistics when we talk about partisanship is the approval rating for senators or for Congress versus the rate at which different representatives get reelected, the reelection rates. So approval ratings are going to be really low, but reelection rates are going to be really high. And so that means that it's like, culturally, it's my guy and gal is doing what I want them to. It's all the rest of them, right? And so there's trust of your own close association and a distrust of associations that are further afield. And I feel like we're seeing that just on this huge scale, right?
Yeah.
Like, I live in Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser is my mayor, right? Like, she sends out a tweet telling us what to do. I feel a very strong sense of trust in that she knows what the situation is for her and for my city. I do not feel that same sense of trust for California. I don't know what's going on in California. I have lots of family in California. And I love California dearly. I visit it regularly. But I think that one of the complexities of any sort of like the attempt at uniformity in the United States is that we are such a diverse nation. And I think that having that perspective is really hard. And actually, Tocqueville does this phenomenal job at the end. I'm a big Tocqueville fan. I did my undergraduate thesis on him. But there's a beautiful moment at the end that you can't see the diversity of a democracy because it's too broad. The only person who can see it are someone who would have the eyes of God, is what he says in the very last chapter. But this idea that there needs to be public trust, and I think that many people are trusting a lot of different institutions, but they're also very much not trusting other institutions. And so there's a lot of asynchronicity in the trust economy right now, and it's all being exposed mostly on the internet.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting thing to explore, with your students or with your children if you're at home and you're now working on educating your children in a new capacity, or maybe in continuing in the capacity you have been. But I think that idea, that diversity, and then we talk about it in terms of federalism, right? So thinking about it from a founding perspective, the federal system and the federal government was established to allow for this sort of local control coming out of a sort of Montesquieu philosophy of how does he maintain a republic, but the idea that interests are best represented at a local level. And I think that public trust is facilitated by that local connection, right? You have more faith in your local leaders, whether it's the town that you're living in or the state, than necessarily you do automatically, maybe in the national government. Maybe that's not the case for everyone, but there is something about that local connection that does facilitate that connection.
And there's huge cultural variety even in the United States in how
Yeah.
people feel about those levers of control,
Mhm.
right? So
Yeah.
the culture of New York City, especially post 9/11, is a very different culture than that of Kansas, which is a very different culture than that of Chicago metro
Right.
area, which is a very different culture than that of Southern Illinois.
Yeah.
So I think that all that plurality seems very chaotic,
Mhm.
especially when there's such deep conviction around what responses should be in terms of crisis.
Yeah.
And that can be very upsetting
Mhm.
because your experience is that other people are not seeing or caring about the same things you are.
Yeah.
I think that goes two directions. It can create some tension in culture, but it can also help those rally around those values really clearly.
Mhm.
And you see a lot of that, especially right now, with all these different organizations and community initiatives coming up as people try and serve communities that reflect their values.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a very localized way of seeing those responses and of having that trust and faith in community too, is that you're seeing those actions, right? And now I think we're going to turn to looking at something on more of a national level, so a different kind of crises altogether. But again, I think that this moment is an interesting time to reflect on how the nation has responded in the past for a couple of reasons. One, I think it can help all of us have a better connection and appreciation for what it was like to live through other crises. None of these things can be equivocated. We haven't lived through others, so we don't know what different crises would have been like. But you can at least have a better appreciation for uncertainty and for the challenges that are faced in not knowing what's happening around you. That I think lends to a really interesting way of investigating some of these questions and challenges. One of which was the Great Depression following the stock market crash in 1929. And one of the things that came from that Great Depression was an interesting moment where you had new forms of technology that allowed national leaders to reach into the homes, quite literally, of individuals in ways that they could not beforehand. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president at the time, saw the opportunity for this and very much um, took advantage of that to help reassure the nation at a time of extreme uncertainty through his fireside chats. And so the Bill of Rights Institute actually has done a collection of really excellent narratives called American Portraits, looking at different moments throughout American history. Which, if you're looking for resources to go through during this time with, again, your students or your own kids or whomever you may be with, or just want to peruse them for your own interest, we have a really good list of them on our website at resources.billofrightsinstitute.org. And again, we'll have all these links there. But one of them is on FDR's Fireside Chats and sort of thinking about his approach to these. And so we wanted to do just a quick close read of one of these from April 14th of 1938. So this is much later into the Great Depression and on the eve of the outbreak of World War II in 1939. Of course, America didn't become involved until 1941, but the world was becoming a much more uncertain place during this time. And to look at what words he used and how it is that he approached, again, this question of this appealing to humanity, this trying to establish this public trust, and what it was that the government was trying to do in tackling this crisis, not just from a policy perspective, but also from a communications perspective.
So this first paragraph I just wanted to include because I found it, Easter week is coming up. That's a week of Passover is coming. There's a lot of the major religious groups have important events that are coming up in our calendars. And so I found it interesting that FDR puts forward this kind of exhortation at the very beginning of his speech, speaking to the fact that there's an urgency to what I have to say, and I hope that it will bring you peace in this time of reflection in our religious calendars. But the next paragraph is actually the one I really wanted to focus on. And so he has this, this is an incredible document. It's pretty long. It's about 10 pages printed, but there is a radio version. So if you wanted to give students both this one and the radio version, you could do that. And it gets pretty nitty gritty when it comes to some of the economic theory that he's working off of. But I thought this paragraph was a fascinating moment for conversation that could take students in a lot of different directions, because he's making a lot of very bold statements, which one could agree or not agree with. So Kirk, why don't you read us through it?
Sure. So starting at the top, history proves that dictatorships do not grow out of strong and successful governments, but out of weak and helpless governments. If by democratic methods people get a government strong enough to protect them from fear and starvation, their democracy succeeds, but if they do not, they grow impatient. Therefore, the only sure bulwark of continuing liberty is a government strong enough to protect interests of the people, and a people strong enough and well enough informed to maintain its sovereign control over its government. We are a rich nation. We can afford to pay for security and prosperity without having to sacrifice our liberties into the bargain. So a lot strikes me here. I mean, a lot of this too, I think, it is a part of a continued debate that's still going on policy-wise in the United States, which is to what level is the government responsible for different securities and different people. But what really strikes me at this moment is thinking about what the line is between the government working to secure liberties and when the government is overly strong, right? And I think we've seen that play out very much during this time with debates about, is shutting down these non-essential businesses the right course? Is it just necessitated by the horrendous nature of the COVID-19 pandemic? Where does that line fall, right? And that debate and that discussion, I think, will continue as this period of uncertainty extends. I think that will only grow more and more in intensity. And I think it's helpful to keep in mind that that same question has been at the core of many debates and conversations, beginning all the way back in 1787 into 1788 during the ratifying convention debates about what is the proper amount of power to be delegated to the government, and how ought the government exercise that to the benefit of the common good, right? So if we're promoting the general welfare, what does that really mean? And how can we most effectively do that? And here I think FDR is turning to this to talk about, to talk with the American people, and something that stands out to me. He uses we, right? He's not separating himself from the people. He's talking we are connected together, really referencing almost back to the we the people mentality, that our government is our own. We control it through elections and through being vigilant and in asking questions exactly like this one. And in working to better understand that, I think he's stepping in to speak to the American people on their level, to reassure them that the American government, or the national government in this case, is trying to do what it thinks best in this situation.
Right. And what I find so also interesting about this paragraph is it's very clear that he's using rhetorical responses, right? So the question I would ask students is, who is he arguing against? Implicit in this argument is another argument about the role of the power of government and its danger. And so how is he responding to those concerns? And then you could even, again, I don't know how much time you have, but you could even go back to the Federalists and Anti-Federalists and look at the same concerns and arguments about the role of a government strong enough to protect people, and what its risks and rewards are. And there's just so much in this paragraph for a free response, or a seminar, a simple discussion that you could do with your students.
Yeah, and just to read a quick passage I have from our American Portrait narrative, which I think it just really struck me, and I think it's an interesting thing to do with students too, regardless if you chose to look at this Fireside Chat or any of the I think nearly 30 that FDR gave while he was in office. But we have a passage about a novelist named Saul Bellow, who remembered what it was like to listen to a Fireside Chat. He said he was walking on a Sunday evening in Chicago just as the summer sun was setting, and he wrote drivers had pulled over, parking bumper to bumper, and turned on their radios to hear Roosevelt. They rolled down their windows and opened their doors, and any pedestrian who walked by could hear his words. You could follow the chat without missing a single word as you strolled by. You felt joined to these unknown drivers, men and women smoking their cigarettes in silence, not so much considering the president's words as affirming the righteousness of his tone and taking assurance from it. And I think, again, that just shows, I think there's really interesting ways to probe constitutional questions during this, but there's also interesting ways to take a step back and look at what the action was and how Roosevelt's actions here are bringing us together as a people, and then looking at our own windows and seeing how it is that different things as they're unfolding are highlighting, some of the best things that communities have to offer, and some of those powerful instances of what it means to be fellow human beings traveling, during this challenging time.
Right, and actually, if we could go straight to the next Tocqueville quote again, that Tocqueville quote. I think, Kirk, there are a lot of historical moments and historical speeches that teachers could turn to in this moment. We were just kind of brainstorming some of the top of our head, the Reagan speech during the Challenger disaster, Bush's speech at 9/11. What are some other ones you're thinking about?
Even going across the ocean and looking at Winston Churchill's speeches, both in May of 1940, when he first becomes prime minister, and then also on June 4th of 1940, after the Dunkirk evacuation, when Britain is very much on its own and is facing a long period of uncertainty. Those are very powerful. I think, again, being able to investigate what those are like. But then on a little bit different tone, another one that occurred to me was Lincoln's first inaugural address, which is a very different kind of crisis, but Lincoln, particularly in the final paragraph, appeals to the sacred bonds of memory that bind us together. And that passage is always very powerful to me, because it speaks to the often unspoken, sometimes explicit, connected history that all of us have in living in this nation together. And that's not as much of a common cultural past 100%, because we're a very diverse nation, but there is a common cultural past in the civic associations and in the civic lives that we live, that are bound together by the documents of the Declaration and our Constitution that create the society in which we live. And there's a very powerful sense of all of us being under those and being treated equally under the law and with equal dignity, that allows us to have those shared moments. And I think it's a very powerful thing to reflect on now.
Absolutely, is what binds us together. And that's the thing that I've been doing just in my own life, is collecting amazing stories of individuals who are doing generous and supportive things, right? Whether it's the distilleries turning to making hand sanitizer, or I have a friend whose family owns a fabric wrapping paper company, and they've gone to making medical supplies. And so I think that there's been a lot of discussion about how students can catalog their own experience and their moment, and how teachers can support them cataloging this experience for themselves in a kind of historical way. One of the things that I've been doing is making sure that those stories of the individuals and associations, the mutual aid, the small acts of generosity and community are uplifted and exposed and honored and supported. And so I think that that's the spirit of the Tocqueville kind of understanding of what makes America special and unique and capable of weathering storms in our time.
Yeah, and I think it's worth underscoring too the importance of the work of our educators at this moment too, because I think it truly is times like these that it's not. I think sometimes there's a temptation to say, oh well, we can put aside education during these times of uncertainty because there's more important things that need to go on. But I think it's precisely those uncertain times when education becomes most important, because it's only through education that we begin to be able to make sense and process and work through these kinds of crises and challenges. Because life, unfortunately, is a very uncertain thing. There's a lot of bumps in the road for all of us in our own lives, in our own ways, and whether we're living through a tragedy like this, or we're living through our own personal challenges. The centrality of education, the importance of knowing our own history and our own past, and knowing what it is to be a part of these communities, and how it is that we can best help promote the prosperity of others and help promote, you know, our communities, and to work together as human beings, and to study and think about these very difficult, big questions. I think now as much as ever is an important time to think about and investigate these things, and is a time in which we can really put into perspective how critical important these questions are, how fortunate we are in many of the things that we have, and how we can continue to grow and improve as a society as well.
So this is where we turn to you all, our listeners and viewers. Bill of Rights Institute has about 3,500 different activities and resources. It's really hard for us, not being in the classroom, not being in your community, knowing what you need. So if you could, in your comments, chats, reach out to us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and let us know what kinds of resources you're looking for right now. The more specific you could be, the better. We will have our team answer every response that makes a request. We are here for you. And you're always doing some of the most important work in America. I say that at every program that I do with the Bill of Rights Institute. It's just even more apparent now, I think, to society that you are doing some of the most difficult and most important work as we think about how to create a sense of stability for a generation of young people through what we're going through. So thank you for everything you do. Thank you for giving us a little bit of your day. We know that days blend together in weird ways right now. And we're here to support you. So please reach out. You have our emails or our social media. Comment in this. Let us know how we can better support you right now.
Absolutely. And we have lots of series of videos, our homework help series, if you haven't seen that, on YouTube. But in addition to that, all of our resources are available free and for your use. So if there's different ways we can package them, if there's different ways that we can get them to you with lower barriers than a PDF, whatever we can do to help support you, we are here to do that. And so thank you, as Rachel said, for joining us for a few minutes. We really appreciate it. And we hope that we can continue to be there to help you in whatever way we can be.
Take care of yourselves and your communities.
Yeah, thank you all. Stay healthy and safe and well.